Hello, everyone. This is Parrish Alford with the Daily Journal. I'm joined by Logan Lowery, our Mississippi State beat writer, and special guest Edgar Thompson of the Orlando Sentinel, because it's Dan Mullen week here on Double Coverage. We're going to talk all things Mississippi State and Ole Miss for the next half hour or so. And Logan, I guess the big game, man, that everybody has circled, it's here. It's Dan Mullen week, and how are things at Mississippi State?
Well, you're right. I mean, this game's been circled ever since Dan Mullen left. I think he left 3 days after the Egg Bowl last year, but this game's been circled by Mississippi State fans for all that time. The problem is Mississippi State thought they would be undefeated heading into this ball game, but obviously they had a little bit of a wind taken out of their sails last week with that loss in a bad loss at Kentucky this past week, and they did not play well at all during that ball game. So, a little bit of luster taken off this game for that reason, but obviously there's going to be a lot of emotions playing into the game against Dan Mullen and all those assistant coaches that he brought with him from Mississippi State.
All right, so we'll hit that Kentucky game later in the program here. Ole Miss is at LSU. We're going to talk about the Rebels at 3-1, coming off a win over Kent State. But Edgar, let's talk a little bit with you, man. First of all, thanks for coming on.
Oh yeah, I always like when I'm referred to as a special guest. It's pretty rare.
Look, man, I saw some tweets coming out of the Dan Mullen press conference earlier this week, and and there was that Target reference, no Target in Starkville, lots of online shopping, and it took me back to 1998 when Tommy Tuberville was leaving Ole Miss, and it just made me think that Megan Mullen had hired Suzanne Tuberville as a consultant on how to leave Mississippi, because way back in '98. Mrs. Tuberville was very concerned about the not many grocery stores in Oxford, just one, and she was excited to be going to Auburn, a place with more than one grocery store. So was Dan Mullen throwing shade this week?
Was Auburn's that much better? I didn't realize. Gainesville just got a Whole Foods, so now we're upscale here now. But because I live in Gainesville, for people who don't, I work for Orlando, but I'm based here. I don't know. Dan's kind of he likes to quip. He likes to be kind of a jokester. He's a pretty clever guy, smart and funny and sharp. So I don't know whether it was really a shot. It did come out like a little bit of shade, though, towards Starkville. I think at bottom line is he feels like Starkville really embraced him. He had kind of a cute line about, hey, I was a Yankee and they took me in and made me feel like, I belonged. And I was talking to, Mississippi, like a lot of these, southern, deep south towns, they're very parochial and, stick to their own and outsiders. And Dan was definitely one. And he felt like that was, he enjoyed it. He had his 2 kids there, had a lot of success there, set himself up for, what he's doing now. I mean, he wasn't going to stay there forever. And, it's funny. Logan's going to answer some questions I sent him. But I hear there's some sort of like kind of a narrative out there that, Joe Moorhead's like an upgrade. Maybe he will be, but I mean, Dan Mullen put that program together. I mean, that has his stamp on it. And, so does the atmosphere that he left behind that they're going to walk into Saturday night. So hopefully people are appreciative of it. I don't think they're going to welcome him with open arms. I mean, there's definitely going to be some boos and a lot of cowbells ringing.
I'm going to jump out and let you guys do the MSU Florida thing for a little bit.
Well, Edgar, I covered Dan for the whole time that he was here in Starkville, and just was going to get your take on what it's like to cover him on just a day-to-day basis. Because, just seeing some of the stuff out of Gainesville, he's using a lot of the same lines, a lot of the same stuff that I heard for 9 years. I'm hearing a lot of that here, but just, what's your take on covering him for the last few months?
Well, it's funny because I do think that's that coaches do recycle their better lines. Jim McElwain, we were looking after one of his early losses, and then we happened to go look at the CSU loss to like Air Force. It cost them the Mountain West in 14 before he came here. And it was like the exact same lines. It was like, he was saying the exact same thing, calling out his team. So it was kind of like, okay, that's how these guys do it. But look, I covered Dan back 2005 and 6. And I called him in somebody's trying to call me. I'm sorry, guys. I covered him in 05 and 06 here at in Gainesville. And the thing you could already tell that he was like working toward the bigger step. Okay. I mean, he would talk to us after practice every day. This is back when you get guys like anytime you wanted. That's no longer the case anywhere. And he would talk to us for like 30 minutes some nights. And you'd be like, man, he's just kind of working on his material here and working on his presentation. I think he's fun to cover. I think he's kind of excitable. I think he's, engaging. I mean, he's pretty funny. He'll tell stories. I mean, he's very tangential. I mean, writing his quotes down and using them, it's kind of difficult at times, but then he'll like stick around afterwards for a few minutes and even chat us up and talk about things, golf with me, because I love golf and he likes to golf. So does his kid, and friendly guy, but we don't get him day to day. We get him like Monday and then game day. But I don't know. I mean, I can't really tell you more than that, I don't think. I mean, he's been pleasant to deal with.
Gotcha. And kind of what's been the pulse of the fan base? I mean, obviously he took over a situation there at Florida where the offense has been pretty bad over the last few years. And, obviously he's no more for that side of the ball. Just kind of what's been the pulse of the fan base regarding these first 4 games under his tenure?
I mean, I think fans wanted Chip Kelly or Scott Frost. They were never getting Scott Frost. And then Chip Kelly kind of scorned the Gators potentially. I mean, they flew a whole contingent up to New Hampshire to maybe get him. And so Dan is perceived as the third choice. Whether he is, I don't know. Maybe Scott wanted to see what these other guys had, and maybe Dan was always his choice. I don't know. They're kind of pushing that narrative a bit, like Scott did not want to go steal the guy that they had him and Greg Byrne had brought in, because he knew that was not going to go over well. And so I don't know where Dan ranked on the choice list, but he certainly didn't ignite like the fan base in terms of run to the ticket window, etc. In fact, I had a story the week before the opener. They were down 9,000 season tickets coming into this year. But a lot of that's the McElwain stink left behind, because that last year left a lot of people with bad feelings about the program. The recruiting hasn't been good under him, and the home schedule is pretty terrible this year. So, I mean, LSU, Missouri, and South Carolina are the only, and Kentucky, those are like the 4 games. And really, besides LSU, that's not like marquee games. They're good games, but not marquee. So, yeah, I mean, I think fans maybe weren't that excited, but I think he went out to get them excited on the speaking tour and bold predictions of winning national titles at halftime of the basketball game back in January. And, he's gone around campus and stirred up interest with sororities, fraternities. He's gone to the gym and played dodgeball with the guys. He runs with the Razzies some days. So he's tried to integrate himself into the whole, deal and get people interested in the program. And I think he did the same thing there early on, didn't he?
Exactly. Yeah, a lot of that sounded like the same MO that he had when he got to state. But Dan's coached some good quarterbacks, during his coaching career. What have you seen from Felipe Franks just then working with him since the spring? Just what kind of progress has he made in such a short amount of time?
I mean, his statistics aren't bad right now because he's not making mistakes. Now, he's not making a lot of big plays either, but he's not playing stupidly and forcing it. The first game Felipe Franks ever played in the Swamp was a spring game as an early enrollee, threw 3 interceptions on 4 passes. So, yeah, it was like, ooh, this was a nightmarish start. And then last year was a rough year. He was benched during 3 different games, lost his starting job twice, and it was a rough road. Took a ton of heat on social media, was scapegoated for the entire season. Him and McElwain were like, public enemy 1 and 2 after the end of that season. He's blocked a bunch of us on Twitter. He's got rabbit ears. So Dan, I think, has tried to instill confidence in the kid more than anything, and belief that, hey, you are my guy. I mean, I'm going to the wall with you. He's come out more than once and just, hey, he's my quarterback. Even if he throws a bunch of picks, he's still my guy, unless he starts sulking, hanging his head, complaining, whatever. So he's like going with this kid because he sees physical talent there, kind of like a Nick Fitzgerald type, maybe a little bit of a scatter arm, but a big arm. Some running ability, not Nick's level, of course, but he is a big kind of, long striding 6'6" athlete. So he's trying to build his confidence up, and he seems to be getting a little more confident, managing the game a little better, not making the mistakes that are killer. And, you know, that's progress, because last year, man, he took tons of sacks. I think he was sacked 29 times, 8 picks, 9 interceptions. This year, he's like 12 touchdowns right now, maybe. Maybe just a couple picks, I think. He had one against Kentucky. He had one against Kentucky. I can't remember otherwise. And, you know, he's run a little bit, like, and showed a willingness to do it. And he was never a runner. I mean, he's a pocket passer. So he's developing. I mean, I don't know what we have here. I mean, is he going to become Nick Fitzgerald? Maybe. Is he going to become Dak Prescott? I mean, that'd be a big ask. I mean, I don't know. But you know, he's the guy, and we'll see what he does. And this will be a big test for him, because Tennessee is a bad team. This is a legit defensive front that's really going to like challenge this team, because the offensive line has been real suspect so far.
Hey, Edgar, I got a question for you, man, and probably the last one. We'll let you go after that.
Yeah, no, I'm rambling. Sorry, guys.
No, man, it's good stuff. One, why was McElwain not successful? I mean, you know, he was a hot enough name. You know, he had the Saban connection there. What was his time there like?
Okay, let me see. So he came in like thinking he was Nick Saban, kind of, for one. A lot of these guys do. Kind of caught that a little bit with Muschamp too. Just because you're, you know, fall from the tree doesn't mean, you know, you're the tree. I mean, it's so he came in. I think he was a little bit arrogant about things. I mean, he's saying that Clarabella's dog to play quarterback. You remember all that? He was famous for that, and never developed a QB other than Will Grier, who, with the PED suspensions in 2015, that really was the beginning of Jim McElwain's downfall, because he never had a good quarterback after that, really. Okay. And I believe the offense was too complicated, and also too simplistic, if it can be the same thing. They were very predictable, but like their play calls and things, like I remember when they threw that touchdown to, Tyree Cleveland, maybe, was it the Hail Mary, or it could have been the Callaway one to beat Tennessee. It was one of those Tennessee ones at the end. And what was the play call? And it was like 14 words: train right, this, that, and the other, blah, blah. And you're trying to get it's almost like you're trying to be too smart and you're overwrought, and you're dealing with, like, I mean, Felipe Franks is not a Rhodes Scholar here, and he's young. I mean, it's like, that's a lot to put on a kid, and they couldn't get play calls in last year at the ends of games. Like LSU, it was brutal. They didn't know what they were doing. So I think that the offense was too complicated and too simplistic. I think that McElwain, you know, was kind of arrogant about how easy it was, just because he'd done it at CSU and done it at Alabama. And the last thing is the recruiting is brutal. I mean, they didn't have a top 10 class during his 3 years. Now, they were in the teens, which isn't awful. But at Florida, I mean, you're not even getting one top 10 class in 3 years, which goes to staffing to me. I don't think he had a great staff. I don't think he hired a lot of great people around him. I mean, he had one guy on here who was almost a buddy of his, Greg Nord, who was a special teams coach, which were awful, and coached tight ends, which were awful, other than the Jake McGee year. You know, Chris Rumpf was decent, and he's at Tennessee now. That was a decent hire. And Jeff Collins was good and a head coach at Temple. But other than that, Tim Skipper, he thought, was a rising guy. I'm not even sure where he is right now. But it wasn't like a great staff, and they certainly weren't great recruiters. So you could really see Will Muschamp left the cupboard stocked on defense for him. 15 NFL players on those first two defenses. Jim McElwain had 15 guys. And Jordan Sherritt would be in the NFL if he hadn't had a career-ending hip injury. So he really left it stocked. And Dan Mullen did not inherit a defense like that at all. So, yeah, those are the reasons. If there are probably more, but those would be the ones I'd point to.
Edgar, good stuff, man. Thanks for being with us. And, man, I hope you shoot a personal best there on the golf course there in West Point.
I haven't been able to play enough, man. It's my caddy. I'm going to put him through the paces. He's going to be working on my swing all day.
All right. Hey, thanks a lot. That's Edgar Thompson with the Orlando Sentinel. Hey, folks, Logan, let's turn this over, and we'll see you later. Let's talk a little Ole Miss and Mississippi State now. Logan, let's start with the Rebels. They are at LSU, a big rivalry game. Going to play their former coach. It's not only Mississippi State and Dan Mullen in the play your former coach this week. The Rebels are 0-2 against Ed Ogeron. as the head coach at LSU. And, we talked a little bit about Jim McElwain there, Logan. I'm of the opinion that nobody is as good as they're going to be when they're in their first job. And I go back and I look at Orgeron during his time at Ole Miss, and he was clearly in over his head. And I've always felt like his relationships with people, his coaches and others were part of his downfall. Now, whether he's improved that, I don't know. But just looking at LSU's notes, since he left Ole Miss, he's like 33-8 or something like that, some real crazy number. He went 6-2 two times in 2 interim jobs, 6-2 at USC, 6-2 at LSU. And then they were like 9-4 at LSU last year. So, I mean, he's winning games. And right now the Tigers are number 5. I don't know if they're that good. These games will play out like they always do. But clearly Ed Orgeron was able to remake himself. And probably Jim McElwain will somewhere. Florida wasn't his first job, but first big job. We'll be interested to see where he goes. But the Rebels are at LSU coming off a 38-17 win over Kent State. Logan, we celebrate, or I do anyway. Okay, that I celebrate the 11 a.m. kickoff, and you just lose something when the 11 a.m. game takes 5 hours and 40 minutes to complete. But that's what happened for the Rebels with 2 lightning delays. And, Logan, we get the lightning delay where there's lightning over in like Siberia. There's some lightning, so we're going to call the game. And everybody sits in the stands and the sun's out, but, the game's delayed. You had that kind of delay. But the second delay was like a man's delay. I mean, it was like a big time, huge dark clouds rolling in and lots of hard rain and some wind-blown rain and the lightning and everything. And, then the power goes out in the press box and, we're not used to being uncomfortable. So that's, that was a big concern. Then the generators went out and, everybody's on battery and hotspot, and that always makes people nervous. But anyway, Logan, the game got over in 5 hours and 40 minutes. And, it was just, I thought there were some things the Rebels could take. Number one, defensively, they're always looking. You're always looking at this team. How can it get better? Can it get better defensively as the season goes along? There were still issues with tackling. There were still issues with receivers running open in the secondary. Now, it's a secondary that for that game didn't have 3 starters. 2 of them aren't coming back. Montrell Custis and Jalen Jones, 2 big losses. They're done for the year. Ken Webster also set out that game, a cornerback. He'll be back this week, most likely. But some issues there in the secondary. But what the Rebels did against Kent State was rush the passer. They were a lot better there. Clearly not a very good offensive line from Kent State, but the Rebels had 7 sacks and 15 tackles for loss, and they dominated in that phase. And maybe there's some confidence they can take right there and maybe build a little bit of momentum from that very good performance in that phase of the game. LSU is going to have a couple of offensive linemen out, it looks like. Still, will be a higher talent level along that offensive line than Kent State was able to provide. But that's something to watch as the Rebels go into this game at LSU, because clearly Ole Miss has been explosive offensively and has been able to dominate offensively against non-conference opponents. That was not the case against Alabama, but against Alabama, you're going to like not just an SEC team, you're going to the best team in the country. Okay, so that was not very surprising, but still, I think it hurt the pride for the Rebels, and they're eager to show that they can get yards and points against good SEC defenses, and LSU will be a very good defensive test here. Going to be very similar in the secondary in terms of their length and some of the things they do there, similar in the sense that they have given up some passing yards between the 20s, but they've clamped down in the red zone. They've ended some drives with interceptions, 6 interceptions on the year, second in the SEC to Alabama's 7. Matt Luke came out earlier this week at his Monday presser talking about high percentage passes, which translates to shorter routes, that curl in front of the safety, a slant, some things like that. He wants to throw high percentage passes this week, get some rhythm going in that Ole Miss offense early, establish some confidence that way, and see if the Rebels can go from there. I think if they do that, I think you're going to see Dawson Knox, the tight end, show up again. We hear Phil Logan, every week tell us that offense is not about design. It's not designed to get the ball to one person. You're not looking for one person. You're chasing space and doing all that. Well, he backtracked a little bit after the Kent State game and said that he wanted to be intentional in trying to get the ball to Dawson Knox. This very athletic tight end, through 3 games, had only 1 catch for 6 yards. So Knox shows up on a couple of drives there in the second half, 2 catches for 79 yards. I think you'll see him more in the high percentage pass game in that approach against LSU. It sounds like that it would play to Dawson Knox's strength, and that's good because he's a very talented athlete, and you can never have enough weapons. So for Ole Miss against LSU, looking back a couple of weeks ago, as I said, the Alabama game, it wasn't about winning and losing. It was about how could the offense perform against Alabama. Similar task this week, but I think the Rebels could spring an upset in Baton Rouge if the offense performs, if they're not shut down the way Alabama shut them down with fewer than 300 yards and 1 touchdown. If the high percentage passes are on the mark, if Jordan Tiamu is accurate with that, LSU will adjust, and maybe they get more man coverage if they're moving with that intermediate passing. If they hit some of those deep opportunities in man coverage, if this Ole Miss offense gets up to around the mid-30s with their scoring, I could see an upset. This is not a dynamic LSU offense, okay? But it's not been necessary to be dynamic to move and score against Ole Miss this season. But the Rebels have, in non-conference games, been able to put up a few stops here and there and force some turnovers. If they can do that, if they can stop an LSU offense with a quarterback who hasn't thrown an interception but is only completing passes at a 49% rate, an LSU run game that doesn't have Leonard Fournette, doesn't have Darius Geis, okay, if they can contain this running game a little better than they have the last 2 years when Fournette ran for 284 yards and Geis ran for 276. If they keep those LSU backs from going off like that, get a few stops along the way, maybe force a couple of turnovers themselves. They've done that for 3 games in a row now with at least 2 turnovers forced. So we'll see. If Ole Miss can do those things, it would not be surprising to see them come away with an upset in Baton Rouge. Look, I know another big game for State this week, but take us back a little bit to the Kentucky game. Give us a Cliff Notes version. What happened?
Well, Mississippi State, there was so much talk that week between Mississippi State and Kentucky back and forth on social media and things like that. And State went into that game playing with a lot of emotions, and I think the emotions took control. State did not hold their composure very well at all during that ball game. Ended up with 16 penalties for 139 yards, and it was penalties on both sides of the ball. 4 unsportsmanlike conduct penalties. They had a rough in the passer, just things like that. Just did not play discipline whatsoever in that ball game. And then you turn around and look at the offensive line. State's offensive tackles, between the 3 of them, between Tyree Phillips and Greg Allen and Stuart Reese, they had 7 of those 16 penalties were just from the tackles alone. They had 6 false starts and 1 holding penalty, and they were behind the chains all day long on offense. And State had so many opportunities early on in that ball game to take control. They went up 7-0, scored very easily on that drive, and then just never could get anything else going offensively. And most of the drives started off like this: first down, they'd run for 5 yards. Second down, they'd have a false start, back it up, 2nd and 10. Then they'd try to throw a pass incomplete. And next thing you know, you're facing 3rd and long, and you gotta complete those. And it was just all day long, and Josh Allen really ate them up off the edge. He had a really strong game for Kentucky. He was named the Defensive Player of the Week in the SEC, and deservedly so. He just tortured Mississippi State, and I think that was really the reason State tackles had such a bad game, because they were either trying to get a quick start on the edge because he was just basically just running straight around them. But, I really wasn't that impressed with Kentucky. They had a good ball play. Benny Snell's obviously a good back. Josh Allen's a good rush edger. Cash Daniels is an up-and-coming linebacker. But, I was really more impressed with Kentucky's scheme than I was with their personnel. They had a really good game plan to get off of that edge and get around those MSU tackles and really just didn't allow Nick Fitzgerald to sit back in the pocket and throw the football with comfort back there. He was running for his life most of the night, and they just never could get anything going because of all the penalties. But, that was kind of the Cliff Notes version of what had happened. I mean, State had so many opportunities to take control of that ball game and just never did. They let Kentucky hang around. That defense was on the field so much, and then finally the defense just, had been on the field so much they got gashed in that fourth quarter, and the offense wasn't doing anything to help them out during that ball game. But they've got to play with more discipline. They've got to play with more composure, especially this week when you look at all the emotions that are going to be going into this Florida game with, the Dan Mullen situation. There's 7 assistants on that side, on that Florida sideline, just assistant coaches. We're not talking about strength staff and extra personnel elsewhere. There's 7 assistants that coach these Mississippi State players. So there's a lot of familiarity with that coaching staff at Florida, and there's going to be a lot of emotions on that field Saturday night. And Mississippi State can't allow those emotions to boil over like they did in that Kentucky game, because that was really their downfall in that ball game. I think Mississippi State's a better team than Kentucky, but they definitely did not show that on the field this past weekend.
Logan, okay, we got like a minute or two left. Give us a Cliff Notes version about matchups, Mississippi State and Florida. Take the emotions out of it. What do you think happens?
Well, obviously, there's a lot of familiarity with that scheme that Florida's going to run. Mississippi State ran it on both sides of the ball. What's really important is what Todd Grantham and that defense have done over the last 2 games. They have 9 turnovers in the last 2 games. So, they're getting a lot of takeaways in these last 2 games. And Mississippi State's not a team that's really turned the ball over that much this year. So if State can take care of the football and not give that Florida offense more opportunities, I think they'll be all right. But, they've got to play more discipline, keep those penalties down. Joe Moorhead said this week that anybody that gets unsportsmanlike conduct penalty is going to come join him on the sideline. When they got back this past Sunday, they had a players-only meeting to discuss kind of the issues. And since that meeting, things, talking to the assistant coaches and players, that meeting did the team a lot of good. So we'll have to see, how much that comes to fruition on Saturday.
Folks, that's it for this edition of Double Coverage, a production of the Daily Journal. We want to thank Edgar Thompson, our special guest who covers Florida for the Orlando Sentinel. Folks, we'll be back again next week for all things Mississippi State and Ole Miss. Come join us.